Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 79 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Edmonton Oilers and lost by a score of 4-2. This was the third matchup between these two teams this season. The first two, both 3-2 losses for San Jose, 1-goal decisions, and here tonight, no different. While the Oilers would add an empty netter here at the end of this game, this was essentially just another 1-goal game that the Sharks do come out on the losing side of things. But when you consider the fact that the Oilers were a team that made it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals Game 7 last season, the fact that the Sharks have managed to keep their season series with Edmonton this close is rather impressive still. Now, when it comes to the game here tonight, it should be noted that the Oilers were rather shorthanded. No Draisaitl, no Nugent-Hopkins, no Jake Wallman, and then early on in this game, Matthias Ekholm left with an injury. A little bit later, Zach Hyman left with an injury. So quite clear that the Oilers' depth was thoroughly tested tonight. But at the same time, the Sharks are not a clean bill of health. They have multiple players missing from their blue line, not to mention the fact that Mike Greer traded away pretty much half the roster back at the trade deadline. These are two very different looking teams than what we may have seen from them in a matchup earlier on this season in like October or November. When it comes to this game, the Sharks played pretty well. Would I say that they were better than Edmonton? Certainly not. The Oilers were definitely the better team, but the Sharks hung around here tonight. They kept it pretty close, and we still managed to get an entertaining finish. But it didn't really start out this way. The first period seemed to be so heavily in favor of Edmonton that this could have ended up being a little bit of a blowout. It starts off with an Evan Bouchard goal on the power play. The Sharks' penalty kill continuing to struggle. It's not that much of a surprise that Edmonton would be able to take advantage of it, despite multiple of their key players missing here in the lineup. As long as McDavid is there, he's going to make something happen, which he absolutely did multiple times here tonight, factoring in on all 4 of these goals. So that made it 1-0 Edmonton. Then it is Ty Emberson, former San Jose Shark defenseman, the lesser known one on this Oilers team with Jake Wallman out of the lineup. It's also his first as an Edmonton Oiler. That made it 2-0. And like I said, it seemed to be snowballing from here, but near the end of the first period, Will Smith manages to stop the bleeding on a very nice play generated from both of his line mates. First, Macklin Celebrini comes in onto Evan Bouchard, forces him to make a quick bad pass reversal that then Kovalenko is able to win the race to by lifting a stick, feeds this one to Will Smith, and then that beats Calvin Pickard, their goaltender in between the pipes for Edmonton. That made it 2-1, and that really got the Sharks some momentum here tonight, because once the second period rolled around, this was definitely the best 20 minutes of action that the Sharks had tonight. You could certainly say San Jose, at the very least, looked better than Edmonton in this middle frame. The Oilers were held off the score sheet, and the Sharks managed to add one of their own, which tied up this game. Certainly a lucky bounce that goes in for Henry Thrun, but at the same time, Bouchard's goal deflected off of Alex Wenberg, so what goes around comes around there, and it is a 2-2 game after 40 minutes. Going into the third period, as has been the case in many of the last few Sharks matchups, the fact remains is that San Jose doesn't have a ton to play for. It is not easy to generate a ton of energy for themselves heading into this third period to try and get themselves the win, when on the other hand, Edmonton, who, they don't exactly have an immense amount to play for, but this was an opportunity for them to clinch a playoff spot here tonight. It was not really ever in doubt that much, but it's nice to get that X next to your name on the standings anyway, so they needed at least a point in this game, which they would end up getting, and it is Corey Perry once more on the power play, as the Sharks' penalty kill just cannot really do much of anything. That made it 3-2, which ends up also being the game winner. Eventually, an empty netter is added, and it is a 4-2 regulation loss for San Jose. Moving on to the standings update. One of the potential last standings updates we're actually going to have to do here, because with this regulation loss, the Sharks remain at 51 points with just 3 games remaining on their schedule. And while the Chicago Blackhawks did not play here tonight, they did play yesterday, where they took on the Boston Bruins and won by a score of, I believe, 5-2 in that game. That gave them 2 points, putting them up to 56, a 5-point lead over San Jose. Jose. Now, the Sharks aren't fully out of the woods just yet. Because they don't have the tiebreaker, they would need to pass Chicago in points, and they could do that if they win each of their remaining 3 games, while Chicago loses in regulation all 3 of their remaining games. But the likelihood of this happening is rather low, and the moment Chicago picks up even a single point, or the Sharks fail to score even a single point, the last place position in the standings is secured for San Jose. So this can happen as soon as tomorrow, where Chicago will be facing off against Winnipeg, but will probably end up happening by the end of this weekend, let's say, at the after Sunday, because the Sharks will be playing against the Calgary Flames, who, as far as I am concerned at this moment, are beating the Minnesota Wild, which keeps them very heavily involved in the playoff race in the Western Conference, which seems to be now coming down to the wire. And considering that Flames game will now be a must-win for Calgary, I would be pretty surprised if they can't at the very least pick up 2 points, even if it takes overtime for themselves. So it seems as though at this point, while it is not 100% guaranteed, the Sharks should have the best lottery odds. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line again of Smith, Celebrini, and Kovalenko. And I actually want to start talking about Will Smith, because as a whole throughout this 60-minute game, was Smith spectacular? Was he an outstanding standout player on every single shift that he had? Not necessarily. This was, as a game, not exactly the most well played by San Jose, despite it being pretty close here. Obviously, the Oilers had the advantage in both the first period and the third period. But what really stood out here from Will Smith is the fact that even if he is not making that massive impact, he is still able to get tons of great chances. I have called this out in many previous reviews over these last few months since Will Smith really started this hot streak, but it is just so impressive how it continuously ends up happening. So not only does he score this goal that makes it 2-1 and really shifts momentum in favor of San Jose, but he had a ton of other great chances. You could look at maybe at least 3, 4, 5 different looks in which he either misses the net, or it's saved, or he shoots it wide, or, you know, in the case of a third period opportunity where he decides to kind of not shoot it and then ends up losing out on the opportunity. But he is finding himself in these dangerous positions. And that is the mark of a great player, because throughout a regular season, you're not always going to be at your best. You're not always going to be playing an amazing game of hockey. It's a long 82-game stretch over a full regular season game. Just take a look at Connor McDavid on the Edmonton Oilers side of things. Him tonight, do I think McDavid, every single shift he stepped on the ice, he was a difference maker? Honestly, not quite. I thought he was, as usual, quite noticeable, but the bar is set very high for the best player in the NHL, and I don't think he hit it every single time. And yet, at the end of the night, you check the box score, and McDavid has 4 assists on all 4 of these Edmonton goals. That is the mark of an extremely good player who can still make an impact even if they're not playing at their best. And that's exactly what Will Smith was able to do here tonight. I'm not trying to compare Smith with McDavid, obviously, but the fact is that Smith, he left a mark on this game. When it comes to his 2 line mates next to Celebrini, obviously, was always going to be very difficult to match what he was able to do the other night against Minnesota, where he picked up 5 points. He doesn't end up with even a point on the scoreboard in this game, though he obviously had a huge impact on that Will Smith goal, just doesn't quite end up getting the secondary assist, despite having forced that turnover from Evan Bouchard. But all in all, I still thought Celebrini was rather good. Once more, it is basically Celebrini and Will Smith leading this team's offense, trying to will this team over the finish line. Couldn't quite do it here tonight, but can't say that Celebrini didn't try. He was not great in the first period, but as the game went on, he got better and better. And then when it comes to their final line mate, Nikolai Kovalenko, he again finds himself in this position, and I imagine this will remain this way for the rest of the year. Colin Graff being sent down to the Barracuda, it is quite obvious that the Sharks just only really have 6 players who can even find themselves in the top 6 and not be completely out of place. I guess technically Klim Kostin could end up getting a chance on this top line with Smith and Celebrini, but I don't think Kovalenko has had a bad enough game to actually be warranting of a healthy scratch or warrant of being sent further down the lineup, because again, I thought Kovalenko looked pretty solid. Are there some mistakes being made? Those moments, and this is something that has kind of plagued him throughout this season, those moments where he tries to do too much and ends up giving the puck away? Absolutely, these are moments that are still occurring and something to clean up. But over these final few games of the season, when you're just trying to encourage some offense, see what you got out of these offensive players. The fact is that Kovalenko has fit in quite well with both of these guys. He is a decent playmaker. He works well below the goal line and along the boards. He gets this good pass over to Will Smith. So you got to say that he was at least rather effective and made up the potential best line, at the very least the most high scoring line of the San Jose Sharks here tonight. When it comes to their second line, a little bit disappointing, I will say, and I'll start off with Alex Wennberg, who just doesn't seem to be really managing to put things together all that much. The rumor seems to be that he might be dealing with some sort of nagging injury that he is deciding to play through, and I honestly would believe that at this point, because again, ever since that giveaway to Coronado against the Calgary Flames, he just hasn't quite been all there. Here tonight, not too different. I don't think Wennberg had a huge impact on the game tonight. The same goes with his line mate Tyler Toffoli, who I don't think was super impactful either. Seems Toffoli has taken a little bit of a hit from no longer being on that top line with Smith and Celebrini. Like I said, they are the two leading offensive forces on this roster, and Toffoli not quite being able to ride on the coattails a little bit anymore. And then, since he's not going to be being set up by Wennberg, who has been struggling as of late, it is not that much of a surprise that Toffoli wouldn't be able to have a huge impact on a game-to-game basis. And when it comes to their final line mate, William Eklund, I do think Eklund was probably the strongest player on this grouping of players. He, at the very least, was able to have that takeaway on the Oilers defenseman that led to this Henry Thrun goal in the second period. That was a very nice play for himself. And all in all, I think he was maybe had some somewhat standout moments over Wennberg and Toffoli, but still nothing outstanding for Eklund, but I thought he was okay. When it comes to the Sharks' third line next, or to general of the bottom six, obviously, this is a grouping of players that has had very, very few standout performances as of late. In particular, the third line has been kind of just a disaster on a game-to-game basis. But for tonight, it was a nice change of pace. Honestly, I thought all three of these players looked a lot better than they have as of late, and some of their best games that they've even had as San Jose Sharks, considering all three of these players weren't even with the team about a month and a half ago. So starting off first with Noah Gregor, he was probably the most effective player for the San Jose Sharks in the first period. It's not really saying much, but the fact is that he was able to use his speed to kind of open up the neutral zone a little bit. There was one play where he completely deked out Evan Bouchard to get a good chance on net. And so Gregor, as we know, his standout attribute as a player has always been his speed and has definitely not his finish, and that continued to be the case here tonight, where he had 2 or 3 of these good chances that he couldn't actually quite beat Picard on. But still, the fact that the chances are there and that he's not just constantly hemmed into his own defensive zone, not playing particularly well, it is at the very least a slight sign of progress. Is it enough to necessarily get him another contract with this team? Hopefully not. But is it enough to maintain a spot in the lineup? Almost certainly, considering he was managing to do that even when he was playing poorly. When it comes to Ostapchuk, I obviously haven't been the biggest fan of Ostapchuk. Just the circumstances that brought him here to San Jose in that Fabian Zetterlund trade weren't looked at too favorably by myself. I would say I've not necessarily allowed that to impact my belief of what Ostapchuk has done thus far as a San Jose Shark, but it is quite clear that he hasn't managed to make a huge impact. The fact that he went his first 8 games with San Jose without a single shot on goal. But I will say here tonight that I do think this was potentially his best game as a San Jose Shark since arriving. Now, the bar is not very high. It is not difficult to eclipse what Ostapchuk has done in his previous outings with this team, but still, the fact is that progress seems to be being made, even if it is a slow but sure process. Ostapchuk is also now starting to be used on the Sharks' penalty kill moving forward, which is something that I expected to happen, and it didn't actually occur in those first few games. But now with Graf gone especially, and Ferraro also being injured, though of course he's a defenseman, there are a lot of holes on this team to be filled in that role, and Ostapchuk is stepping into it. Obviously, it's not the greatest outing, considering 2 power play goals given up, but all in all, and especially in the 5-on-5, I do think he looked pretty decent. And then when it comes to Cam Lund, he's been more so struggling as of late. You could definitely point to him as one of the major reasons for why this third line hasn't looked all that fantastic over these past few games. He's still learning what it takes to find some success on a consistent basis in the NHL, but here tonight, tonight, I thought he was decent enough. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Dellandrea, Goodrow, and Grundstrom, the three, likely suspects here. These are the three players who will probably make up the fourth line for pretty much the rest of this season, unless Kostin manages to find his way back into Warsawski's good graces. But that doesn't seem super likely, and so it is these three players there on that fourth line. And you know what? Goodrow did have like one or two pretty good scoring chances early on in this game, and while nothing pretty much ever came after that, Grundstrom didn't have his usual chance, and Dellandrea ends up just taking another penalty for himself, which I guess is expected. The fourth line, I guess, wasn't like a massive liability, so maybe that's a positive, sort of. When it comes to the defensive side of things, before I get into the individual players, I do want to say that I am very surprised with this defensive group here tonight. Yes, I mentioned already the Oilers are rather shorthanded, but they still got some pretty good players. Evan Bouchard on the blue line, Connor McDavid, of course, at forward, and a couple of other names like Arvidsson and Henrique and Perry, who can be difficult-ish players to handle from an offensive perspective. And then when you take a look at this defensive core for San Jose, it really doesn't inspire a ton of hope. I mean, your number one defenseman is Timothy Liljegren, who going back to like November was the Sharks' 5th or 6th defenseman in their lineup. And then you have Thrun, who is a borderline NHL defenseman, Vlasic, who's somewhat borderline, Ruda, who's somewhat borderline. You could say all three of those guys are basically like players who probably wouldn't be on a playoff team at this point. And then both Carlson and Thompson are AHL players. So this is not a defensive core that you would really want to ever start multiple games with. And yet the Sharks, because of these injuries, because of these trades, are having to do so. And they did their absolute best here tonight. Was it a perfect game? Obviously not. But I do have to commend them for doing as best as they possibly could. It was honestly pretty decent. When it comes to this top pairing of Thrun and Liljegren, I was very surprised to see that they actually managed to hold their own in this game. Thrun, as I've mentioned multiple times in the past, has been a bit of a disaster since returning from his injury, and Liljegren has always shown himself to be very up and down when it comes to his defensive play. Sometimes he's reliable, sometimes he's very much not. But in this game, I thought, obviously, there are going to be some errors that stand out, especially when you're playing against McDavid and you're not going to be able to keep up with that player. But all in all, I think they did some decent enough things to be pretty good by the end of it. When it comes to this second pairing, we have Ruda and Carlson. Ruda making his, I guess, triumphant return to the Sharks lineup. It's very important that this did occur because Ferraro is out for the remainder of this season. The Sharks would have had to call somebody up from the Barracuda if Ruda was not healthy enough to play, and I don't think they want to be doing that at this point with just a few games remaining on the Barracuda schedule, and they're kind of trying to ramp up for the playoffs. So the fact Ruda is healthy enough to go is a good thing. I didn't think I'd ever be saying that this season, to be happy with Ruda in the lineup, but here we are. And honestly, my feelings about Ruda are not a secret. Obviously, I'm not a big fan of this particular player, and I'll be pretty happy, that's maybe being a bit mean, but I'll be pretty happy to see Ruda not with the Sharks next season, as long as Mike Greer doesn't randomly give him a contract. But to be fair, I thought actually Ruda looked pretty good in his return game. It's basically, the bar is not high for Jan Ruda, but I think he did some decent things defensively, and so I was relatively impressed with him in this game. When it comes to Lucas Carlson, kind of like with Henry Thrun, his defensive play has been very rough over these last few games, but in this one tonight, I thought Lucas Carlson was rather solid. Offensively, we got to see a bit more contributions from him. He had a couple of close calls, but defensively, I think he did some solid work as well. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing of Vlasic and Thompson, a couple of rough moments in this game for sure. Thompson losing the body position onto Connor Brown in this game. That led to a very good chance for himself. There are some rough moments. Thompson continuing to struggle in the areas that we know he struggles with, and Vlasic not really having the speed to keep up with some of these more speedy Edmonton forwards at times. But I don't think that it was a horribly rough night for either of these two players. And then when it comes to the Sharks goaltender, we have Georgi Romanov. So a bit of a trade of starts between him and Georgiev at this point, and it certainly makes a ton of sense. Romanov, a couple of nights ago against the Calgary Flames, was rather solid despite a 3-2 loss. Then we see Georgiev let in 8 goals the other night against Minnesota, of which at least a couple of them were rather weak. So it shouldn't be that much of a surprise to see Romanov back between the pipes for this particular game, especially since he had actually played against the Oilers about a week ago where he was also rather good, and while he fails to actually record his first career win in the NHL, he again only lets in these 3 goals. Could he have maybe had one of these? Perhaps. The Bouchard one is an unfortunate deflection, and he's got basically 0 chance on the Edmondson goal, but perhaps he could have been a little bit more solid on the Corey Perry goal. It's kind of splitting hairs here. All in all, I think he did his absolute best to try and keep the Sharks in this game, and while it was not quite enough, I still thought he was rather good. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Sunday, where they'll be taking on the Calgary Flames, as I mentioned earlier on. That Flames team now is really trying to make a push to the playoffs, and so the schedule continues to not be particularly easy, as the Sharks are just facing off against desperate team trying to clinch in the case of the Oilers here tonight. So we'll see if the Sharks can break out of their current 8-game losing streak. Hopefully they can pick up at least 1 win prior to the end of this season, and remember, it only takes 1 missed out point or 1 point generated by Chicago to secure those best possible draft lottery odds. Class dismissed.